He followed the law, he carried legally, he still didn't make it home. On a Saturday in Minneapolis, a 37-year-old man named Alex Pretty was killed by immigration agents during an altercation. Within hours, two completely different stories began to form, and both claimed to be defending the same principles. One side said this was about law and order, the other said this was about rights. But those two ideas collapsed into each other the moment Pretty was shot while lawfully carrying a firearm. Here's the contradiction that matters to you. If following the law can be reframed after you're dead, then legality stops being protection and starts becoming evidence. What happened to Pretty isn't just about one encounter on January 24th, 2026. It's about what happens when the state decides that a right becomes suspicious the moment it complicates enforcement. The administration moved fast, not to ask questions, not to pause, but to lock in a narrative. And here's why that should make you stop scrolling. Because once the story hardens, facts don't just explain events, they get repurposed to justify them. And that's where this story flips. What makes this moment different is not just what happened, but how narrowly the story was first presented. A man is dead. Federal agents fired the shots, and yet the official framing never treated this as an open question. It was introduced as a closed case almost immediately, with the emphasis placed not on the killing, but on Pretty himself and the fact that he was armed. Only part of the picture was offered. Yes, there was an altercation. Yes, immigration agents were involved. Yes, Pretty was carrying a firearm legally, but the broader context was left out, that he was described as a good Samaritan, that his actions were initially seen as lawful, and that the encounter escalated into lethal force anyway. This wasn't framed as an isolated incident. It was treated as a pattern enforcement officials already understood. Armed civilian, federal agents, split-second judgment, case closed. But here's the question that reframes everything. If lawful carry is no longer neutral in the eyes of the state, then what exactly does lawful mean when enforcement feels threatened? Because once that line shifts, it doesn't just affect one case in Minneapolis. It resets expectations everywhere. And now watch how fast this escalates. The administration's strategy becomes clearer when you look at what they chose to emphasize. Almost immediately, senior officials began circling one detail: the gun, not the timeline, not the decision-making, not the escalation. The focus locked onto the fact that Pretty was lawfully carrying a firearm, and then quietly began to twist what that meant. Multiple top officials went out with aligned language. The message was consistent. The presence of a gun made the situation inherently dangerous. In some cases, they went further, suggesting that even common carry practices, like possessing an extra magazine, signaled something darker. That detail matters because an extra magazine is not illegal. It's ordinary. It's preparation, not intent. Here's the move. If lawful equipment can be reframed as suspicious, then the definition of threat expands without changing the law itself. The action stays legal. The interpretation does not. Notice what's missing from this framing. There is no sustained discussion of de-escalation. No acknowledgement that Pretty was initially viewed as a good Samaritan. No pause to examine whether the presence of a legally carried firearm should, on its own, justify lethal force. Instead, the burden quietly shifts. The agents are assumed justified. The dead man is asked to explain himself. This is where the story stops being about one shooting and starts becoming a test case, because if this logic holds, it won't stop here. What happened next is where the temperature rises. The language didn't soften, it hardened. What began as a justification became a standard. The implication was no longer that this situation was tragic and complex, but that it was predictable, almost inevitable. This is how normalization works. Something extreme happens once, and instead of being treated as a warning, it's treated as confirmation. Armed civilian encounters federal agents. Lethal force follows. The conclusion isn't that something went wrong. It's that this is how these encounters are supposed to end. We've seen versions of this before, not in academic theory, but in real moments when rules quietly shift after the fact. The playbook is familiar. Redefine danger broadly, narrow the space for civilian judgment, and prioritize officer safety above every other consideration. Over time, what would have shocked people a decade ago becomes accepted procedure. But here's the part nobody wants to confront. Lawful carry was once framed as a stabilizing force, a deterrent, a right that came with responsibility. Now, in this framing, it's treated as a trigger. When the presence of a gun becomes justification rather than context, the threshold for lethal force drops. And once that threshold drops, it doesn't rise again easily. This is where the story stops being about Minneapolis and starts becoming about precedent. The tension snaps into focus when you compare what was said with what was done. On the surface, officials insisted they were not attacking gun rights. They repeated familiar language about respecting the Second Amendment. But in the same breath, they pointed to Pretty's gear as proof of danger. The most striking example was the fixation on an extra magazine. Not an illegal modification, not a prohibited weapon, just an additional magazine. That detail was elevated from mundane to menacing, used to imply nefarious intent. And that choice wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Here's why that detail changes everything. If an extra magazine can be framed as evidence of malice, then preparedness itself becomes suspicious. The right isn't revoked on paper, it's hollowed out in practice. Now notice the contradiction. The administration's broader platform celebrates armed self-defense and lawful carry. Yet in this moment, the same behavior is reinterpreted as a threat severe enough to justify lethal force. The words stay pro-gun. The actions do not. This permanently alters how you're supposed to read the event. The killing is no longer framed as a tragic failure. It's framed as a rational response to a civilian exercising a right, too visibly, too confidently, too close to federal power. Once that logic is accepted, the line between lawful citizen and legitimate target starts to blur. And once that line blurs, the system doesn't need new laws to change outcomes. Then the situation compresses. Fast. Pressure builds from multiple directions at once, and control starts to slip. First, a senior federal prosecutor steps in with a blunt warning. If you approach law enforcement with a gun, there is a high likelihood they will be legally justified in shooting you. That's not a comment about this case alone. It's a rule being floated in public. Carry near federal agents, and the presumption flips against you. Almost immediately, gun rights organizations react. They don't debate tone. They call the idea dangerous. They reject the notion that lawful carry evaporates the moment law enforcement appears. But notice the speed here. Statements, pushback, damage control, all happening before the facts of the shooting are fully settled. At the same time, the administration doesn't retreat. There's no clarification, no narrowing of scope. The message stays intact. Armed proximity equals threat. This is how mini-crises stack: a death, a justification, a proposed rule, a backlash. Each one adds weight, each one reduces flexibility, and the room to reverse course shrinks with every hour. So ask the uncomfortable question: what happens if this continues? What happens if this logic hardens into policy? Or worse, into instinct? Because once instinct takes over, no memo can pull it back. At this point, the story stops being abstract and starts pressing directly on everyday life. Because this isn't about officials in Washington or statements on cable news. It's about what happens to ordinary people when rules become ambiguous and fear fills the gaps. Imagine you're walking down the street. You're carrying legally. You're doing exactly what the law allows. Now introduce federal agents into that space. According to the logic being floated, your legality no longer protects you. Your presence alone becomes a risk factor. That changes behavior immediately. People hesitate to intervene. They hesitate to help. They hesitate to exist confidently in public spaces. The idea of the Good Samaritan collapses, replaced by a quiet calculation: stay invisible or stay alive. This is the lived consequence, not ideology, not politics, just fear. Fear that your intentions won't matter. Fear that your compliance won't be recognized in time. Fear that explanation comes after the fact, not before the trigger is pulled. And if this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because that recognition matters more than outrage. Here's the unsettling part. Once people internalize this risk, the system doesn't need to enforce silence. People self-police, they withdraw, they disappear from public responsibility. And that's a shift that doesn't make headlines, but it reshapes society anyway. To understand how this keeps happening, you have to step back from the emotion and look at the machinery. Not the personalities, not the headlines, the system. At the center of this is incentive. Federal agencies are rewarded for control, predictability, and risk minimization. Armed civilians introduce uncertainty. They can't be commanded. They can't be paused. And in moments of stress, uncertainty becomes the enemy. So the system adapts, not by changing the law outright, but by changing interpretation. Rights stay on the books, but the cost of exercising them quietly rises. The message becomes implicit. You can carry, just not near us, not visibly, not when it complicates our authority. This is how power maintains itself without announcing expansion. It reframes behavior instead of banning it. It relies on spectacle, the shooting, the statements, the warnings, to teach everyone else where the invisible lines are. Here's the unsettling insight. This isn't about guns alone. It's about who is allowed to act in moments of disorder. The state asserts monopoly not just on force, but on judgment. And once judgment is centralized, every crisis looks the same. Comply instantly or be treated as a problem to be solved. That mechanism is already in motion. From here, the trajectory splits, but neither path is clean. One direction leads toward quiet hardening. The language doesn't become official policy, but it becomes practice. Agents act on it. Prosecutors defend it. Courts are asked to sort it out later. In this path, nothing dramatic changes overnight. Yet encounters like this become more common, more defensible, more routine. The risk doesn't disappear. It spreads. The other path leads toward fracture. Gun rights groups increase pressure, not loudly at first, but persistently. Turnout enthusiasm softens, trust erodes. The alliance holds on paper, but motivation leaks out through the cracks. No mass defection, just absence. Fewer volunteers, less energy, lower margins. Notice the uncertainty. The administration doesn't need to choose openly. Momentum is already doing the work. Each statement, each defended shooting, each refusal to recalibrate nudges the system forward. And here's the key detail. The next move doesn't have to be announced. It only has to be repeated. Because once repetition sets in, direction becomes destiny. And that means the most important moment in this story hasn't happened yet. There's one insight that ties all of this together, and it's easy to miss if you focus only on the politics. The real shift here isn't about left versus right, or even guns versus enforcement. It's about who gets the benefit of doubt in moments of uncertainty. Alex Pretty followed the law. That wasn't enough, because when authority feels challenged, legality becomes secondary to control. Rights don't vanish all at once. They thin out at the edges, where interpretation replaces protection. That's the story beneath the story. Not a sudden crackdown, but a gradual redefinition of what's considered safe, acceptable, and justifiable. Once that redefinition takes hold, outcomes change long before laws do. And this doesn't end with one case or one administration, it sets a template. The question is who notices and who adapts first. If you want to understand how power actually shifts in real time, before it's obvious, before it's settled, this is where you need to keep watching. Follow and subscribe for the next layer of this story, because the pattern doesn't stop here.